So we talked about the anatomy of the heart, right? So we got two receiving chambers, right and left atria, okay? Two pumping chambers, delivering chambers, right ventricle and left ventricle. And I think we kind of mentioned en passe the so-called great vessels. So basically pulmonary trunk right here that branches into the pulmonary arteries that deliver deoxygenated blood to the lungs, and we mentioned the aorta that delivers oxygenated blood to the systemic circulation to all tissues in the body. We also mentioned vena cava, superior and inferior vena cava, that bring deoxygenated blood from the body. Okay. Now, we had a little talk, I want to remind you, we had a little talk about the valves, right? So there are 4 valves in the heart that you should be able to identify. So the function of the valves is essentially to direct the flow of blood through the heart. Because if you think about it, blood flows in exact direction. It doesn't, at this point it's going to go forward and at this point it's going to go backward. If it happens, it's a big problem. What opens and closes the valves? The pressure. If pressure in one chamber or one part is higher than pressure in another, the valve will open or close depending on the pressure relationships. For instance, 2 atrioventricular or AV valves. They separate right atrium ventricles and left atrium and ventricle. Okay, tricuspid here separates right atrium and right ventricle. Bicuspid or mitral valve separates left atrium and ventricle. If you would look at this image here, we talked about this. This is tricuspid and this is bicuspid or mitral. Essentially, when the pressure in the right ventricle increases, blood opens the valve and pushes into the right atrium. Sorry, I'm gonna misspeak a lot. Get used to it. I'm sorry. When the pressure in right atrium increases, blood pushes forward to the right ventricle. When pressure in the left atrium increases, right here, blood pushes towards left ventricle. Does that make sense? And therefore, when the pressure in, say, right ventricle builds up, it will close the valve, because blood will start pushing back and will close the valve. That will prevent the backflow. Does that make sense? Anybody ever questioned why mitral valve is called mitral? Yeah. If you ever saw Catholic priests, especially high-level priests, cardinals and I think even Pope, they wear this funny hats. They go like this. Those hats are called mitra. So mitral valve reminded somebody about this hat. It was called mitral valve. But basically, if you look at the valve, this is tricuspid, right? So 3 cusps. 1, 2, 3. This one is bicuspid. 2 cusps. But we usually call it mitral valve. These valves are anchored to the papillary muscles right here by the structure is called chordae tendineae, as mentioned before. I totally forgot to ask a colleague of mine about the hearts. I'm going to try and do that maybe in the email. The point is, if we get them a little bit too late, we're still going to cut them open. But the point is, if that would be a real heart, and you would try to rip the valves apart, you wouldn't be able to do so. If you would pull on the valve, you would rip the pieces of the muscle out of the heart. Chordae tendineae are extremely mechanically strong. Okay, they, as far as I know, that colleague of mine asked one of his students, a huge, like 7 feet tall, enormous guy, very, very strong guy, extremely strong guy, to try and rip them apart. Well, he separated pieces of the heart, but chordae tendineae remained unaltered, let's put it this way. So when the blood is in the ventricles, eventually it's going to get pushed out into the large vessels, okay, the great vessels. Right ventricle, this one, it will push the deoxygenated blood into the pulmonary trunk, while the left ventricle will push the blood into the aorta. In order to prevent backflow from those vessels back into the ventricles, aorta and pulmonary trunk are separated from ventricles by corresponding aortic, right here, and pulmonary valves. You can see them, pulmonary and aortic valves. These are called semi-lunar. If you would make it's going to be a coronal section of a valve, it will look like this. So this is ventricle side, and this is, say, aorta. When pressure in the ventricle builds up, blood pushes on the valve and valve opens, and blood flows. As blood flow increases the pressure in the aorta, eventually the valve will close back. Does that make sense? A lot of problems associated with valves. When they do not close completely, incompetent valve causes the backflow. So basically, it's like, I mean, you can hear the sound. It's called regurgitation of the blood. But if you think from the perspective of the heart, it has to do additional work to get blood going. It's not good. Okay, to do additional work just to get it going. Another problem with the valve is so-called valvular stenosis. The valve gets stiffened. It's pretty flexible. When aortic, for instance, valve gets stiffened, it doesn't close completely, so it becomes incompetent. And there's a backflow from aorta back into the ventricles. It causes all kinds of problems. Okay, we'll talk about pathologies of the heart. If you think about heart as a muscle, there are two main problems that can happen to it. One, it gets abnormally big. Two, it loses the oxygen supply and dies. There are some problems with like ventricles too, but we'll get to that. Okay. So please be able to identify the valves in these pictures. Okay. And with this, we move on to the pictures. Okay, pictures of the blood vessels. You can see any of these pictures of people, that I have here on the exam. Now, one thing, I'm going to be very open and upfront about it. The printouts that you're going to have are going to be black and white, well, grayscale. But I'm going to put the exam pictures on the screen. So if you need to tell, and I will, what is the vein, what is the artery? But if you want to look at the colored picture, all you need to do during the exam is just ask, can you please put this picture? Can you please put that picture? So this is like a general overview. And what's interesting, you see a certain pattern. Let me explain what I mean. So this is heart, right? Right here. It's heart. I'm going to use black. That's heart. You have aorta coming out of the heart. So you have ascending, very, very short piece of ascending aorta. And then you have descending. Descending aorta is, so it goes up and then it goes down. That part up here is aortic arch. Is that right? Yeah. There's some screw up with pointing. We'll figure it out. I never remember. There's some mistake on the slide. So aortic arch, descending aorta. Descending aorta goes through the diaphragm, and this part is called abdominal aorta. And then as it goes down, you can see arteries branch. If you think about their function, they carry blood, systemic arteries, not pulmonary, but systemic arteries. Carry oxygenated blood to where? Tissues, yeah, they carry it to tissues. So it gets to tissues and it gets branched. Like you drive on the highway and then you go on the side road, it's 4 lanes and then 2 lanes and it's just unpaved something in the middle of a field. Does that make sense? So it gets small. They get smaller and smaller and smaller as they branch. So abdominal aorta, as it descends down, it branches into 2 iliac arteries. Okay, and then iliac arteries branch into the external part, and there's a tiny short internal iliac artery. Now here's the deal. Like this part, you can ask, wait a minute. So you can ask, where does common iliac artery, which is shown like here, where does common iliac artery stop and external starts? Well, external starts when external and internal branch out. So at this point, external and internal iliac arteries branch. Does that make sense? Now, most trembling question. You're going to have questions, is that common, external, or internal? The brief answer is no. I try to avoid things being that close. Does that make sense? I may ask you, is that iliac or is it femoral? Does that make sense? Now you can see that a lot of names of arteries will match the region they are in. Iliac artery, close to the ileum, the part of the intestine. Femoral artery runs through the femoral region. Now, one comment about the pictures. Vessels that are close to you, no matter whether it's back or front of the body, vessels that are close to you are bright, like this femoral artery. Okay? Vessels that are far from you, they will be shaded, like this popliteal artery. Does that make sense? Because where is popliteal region? What is popliteal? Back of a knee. So that's where popliteal artery runs. Okay? It branches off the femoral artery and runs to the back of a knee. Okay? Then you have anterior tibial and posterior tibial artery. Now that's not a complete list, but those are big arteries that you can see on the picture of the entire body. What is the convenience of this picture is that in any, actually, human anatomy, is that we sort of symmetrical. You know one leg, you know both legs. Okay. Does that make sense? Now there are some more small branches. So first of all, what is trunk, by the way? What do you think is trunk, except in the car? So we say there's a pulmonary trunk. What does that mean? Let me bring it back, the picture. So this is pulmonary trunk. What does the trunk word mean? Huh? Very, very short vessel that branches almost immediately after the point of origin. Does that make sense? Like, if you would look at the femoral artery, it's long. Now these are trunks. So you have first, and that another thing that makes sense, that really makes an incredible sense. So you have celiac trunk here. Celiac, what does it refer to? What do you think? Don't hesitate. Just first association, celiac. Digestive, right? Something digestive. Turns out to be mostly stomach. Okay? Then you have superior mesenteric artery. What does it refer to? Mesentery, upper part, meaning small intestine, really. Inferior mesenteric artery. Colon, large intestine, all these parts. Does that make sense? Now, the easiest arteries that can be seen, except for aorta, these two. Any idea? Without even looking at the guides, renal, yeah, because they run to the kidneys, the renal arteries. And I'm gonna tell you a secret. You know, there are adrenal glands, right, on top of that. You know how we call arteries that run to the adrenal glands? Suprarenal, above renal. A lot of these names, they are very reasonable. And I will try to be reasonable in my questions, so it's not like absolutely mind-boggling. So more or less, we're clear with the bottom of the body. Let's talk about upper body. Aortic arch. 3 branches are coming off of it. One is that little so-called, red doesn't work, the black brachiocephalic trunk. It's on the right, because we're looking like backwards. Okay, brachiocephalic trunk, that little tiny black spot. So short, very short vessel. Brachio, what does brachio refer to? Arm. Cephalic, head. And if you think it's head, wait till we get to the veins. There's some really awkward naming there. Okay, but yes, in this case it's head, which means brachiocephalic trunk supplies blood to the head and to the arm. It branches into the huge common carotid artery. If you, the aficionado of old hardcore, like Taiwanese, Japanese, Hong Kong movies with Bruce Lee and stuff like that, there are some situations when the master presses on the point on the neck and the person falls unconscious. You can do it. Well, I don't know if you can do it. I cannot do it. I don't know. But it's a carotid artery. If you press on the carotid artery, it stops the blood flow to half of the brain and the person faints. Okay. You have to hold it for a while, though. Now, carotid artery will branch into the external and internal. We'll get a better picture of it. Internal carotid artery is slightly bigger, external is slightly smaller. Okay? And then they will branch further, delivering the blood to the brain, forming, the cerebral circulation, tissues of the scalp, vertebral tissues, and so on and so forth. And then you have, so brachiocephalic trunk, common carotid, and subclavian. Okay? Subclavian under the clavicle. Then subclavian seamlessly becomes axillary, and then axillary seamlessly becomes brachial. So axillary is armpit. So it doesn't mean that it runs immediately in your armpit, but ballpark, okay, near head of the femur. And then when it enters brachial region, it becomes brachial artery. It's big. Brachial artery branches into the medial ulnar artery. In this case, word medial means the position, anatomical position. So ulnar artery runs along the ulna, okay? And radial artery runs along the radius. One thing that I really should have said. Can you see the white the yellow shades. This should correspond to the study guide. So if it's not shaded, it's not in the exam. Does that make sense? I believe I did a pretty good job matching it, but if there is a mismatch, you trust the study guide, because I look at the study guide when I write the exam. Does that make sense? When I was doing mouse surgery, we were cannulating carotid artery. We're sticking the tube into the carotid artery of the mouse. And it's pretty exciting because you can do it even in people, you can cannulate the artery. What we did, we tied the artery, stopping the blood flow, then we put a clamp and we inserted the cannula, which is pretty much the tube. And you remove the clamp and that's it. When you need to draw the blood, you just pull the plunger. It's a great way to exsanguinate the mouse, which means bleed, okay? Yes, a couple of times. The most common mistake when you do cannulation, what do you think? You tie it, then you nick it, and about to insert the tube. What's going to happen if you nick the artery? Okay, so did you see Kill Bill? When Uma Thurman cuts the heads, there's like fountain of blood. No, it's not that high. But when you nick the artery, even in a mouse, even in an anesthetized mouse that sleeps, there's a fountain. You don't see it like spraying because everything is covered in blood. It's really, and a couple of times I managed to put the clamp back like blindly, and I stopped the bleeding, but it wasn't really an experimental object anymore because it lost so much blood. It was still alive. It would make it through the experiment, but the blood pressure went down dramatically. And on the right, left side, I forgot the left side. So on the right side, you have brachiocephalic trunk that branches into the common carotid and subclavian. On the left side, you have left common carotid and left subclavian branching from the aortic arch independently. If you would go here, okay, so this is brachiocephalic trunk, this is left carotid, and this is left subclavian. Does that make sense? We're good? Now, a little bit more in details. Yes, you will probably see this. Okay, I think you will see all the pictures that are in this part. Okay. So this is your trunk. That's the aortic arch. Here it branches into subclavian, which almost immediately turns axillary, and that's your common carotid. So it branches into the external. Sorry, internal. Internal is bigger, and external. Internal, you see, internal goes deeper. It goes closer to the midline. So external carotid artery will branch into the blood vessels that will supply different parts of the head, like occipital, okay, or temporal, or maxillary, or facial. Maxillary will go to the region around upper jaw, facial will go to the lower jaw, the mandible, superficial, temporal, to the skin of the scalp, and occipital to the back of the scalp. And then you have another artery that branches right over here. This is the vertebral artery. Okay. So it supplies the blood to the tissues of the spinal cord. Does that make sense? Now you can see that I'm not going above what I'm asking. And those are practically pretty much the biggest arteries you're going to deal with. Right. Now this is cerebral circulation, and for some of you it probably looks familiar. Many of you it probably looks familiar. So you have two vertebral arteries, symmetrical, okay, because you have right, the junction where subclavian and carotid arteries branch out, okay. At that junction you have vertebral artery leaving the common carotid on the right and the left side. So they merge and they form basilar artery. And then basilar artery is at the base of the structure that is known to any anatomy student. Circle of Willis. Okay. I just heard about this guy just recently. I don't remember in which instance. The guy named Willis. Something about parasites, but I don't remember what. So, there are several cerebral and several communicating arteries. So cerebral arteries. You have posterior cerebral artery, you have middle cerebral artery, and you have anterior cerebral artery. Okay? So if we would look at it, we can say, okay, you have basilar, you have circle of Willis, okay, you have posterior, you have middle, and you have anterior. Okay? Well, anterior should be drawn differently. Okay. Now, this anterior cerebral artery are connected by the anterior communicating, and these are posterior communicating. Does that make sense? Middle cerebral artery is the continuation of internal carotid. So here you can see that part of internal carotid artery that is cut. That makes sense. Now, what is the clinical importance of middle cerebral artery being connected to internal carotid? Which of these three is the most frequent site of the stroke? MCA. It's middle cerebral artery. It's the most frequent site where the clot ends up. Probably one of the reasons for it is that internal carotid artery is large enough to let the clot through. But when it gets to the MCA, middle cerebral artery, it gets stuck. And that affects both motor cortices of the frontal lobe. It may affect sensory cortices in the parietal lobe. It may affect like auditory cortices in the temporal lobe. Does that make sense? Now, really important thing, if you think about it, having a circle is pretty awesome. Because if something gets stuck in that circle, it doesn't prevent the blood flow to other parts of the brain. So basically, I want to introduce a concept of anastomosis. Here, this is the structure that we can call anastomosis between the middle cerebral artery and anterior communicating artery. Posterior communicating artery is essentially an anastomosis. Anastomosis is, I'm going to spell it. Anastomosis is a blood vessel that connects to other blood vessels. It can be arterial anastomosis, venous or venular anastomosis. Sometimes they are arteriovenular anastomosis that connect veins and arteries. Does that make sense? And anastomosis essentially is like a detour for the blood in case something happens. They allow the blood to select another route. they're not going to prevent they're not going to prevent major adverse effects associated with the blockage of the blood flow, but they will kind of minimize their influence. Does that make sense? So we're going to talk at the arteries of the hand, and we're going to look mostly at the right side. So you've got subclavians, left and right subclavians, right? And then subclavian becomes axillary. Little branch here, suprascapular, the artery that runs above the scapula. Yes? Huh? I can choose the different color. I thought that red didn't do the job, but absolutely. What are we gonna? Can we try blue? Yeah. I totally appreciate the input because I cannot see what you see. So let's try it. So that's subclavian. Better? Okay, good. I'm going to run in parallel too. So that's suprascapular. This is axillary. Okay. And then you have a huge brachial artery and the deep artery of the arm that sort of surrounds the humerus from the posterior region. Okay, and then brachial artery branches into the radial and ulnar. Does that make sense? So you can kind of run it this way, that you have subclavian, axillary, brachial, radial, ulnar. And the deep artery of the arm is right here. Are we good? What I wanted to say. Oh, by the way, can you see your arteries? Can you see your veins? Can you see the arteries? What? Why you can't see them? They deeper. Why they deeper? Of course, if you nick it, you're boned. If you nick a vein, it's not a good thing, but it's fixable. If you nick an artery, it's not that fixable. I mean, it is fixable, but hard. You know, when I was a kid, we had a joke in school. If you nick carotid artery, you need to put a tourniquet on the neck. Now, arteries that supply thorax. So you've got intercostal arteries, which makes perfect sense, really. Okay, posterior intercostal run between the ribs, and then you have two thoracic arteries, internal and lateral thoracic artery, and you have two pairs of intercostals. You have posterior intercostal and you have anterior intercostal. So posterior will supply muscles of the back, anterior intercostals will supply intercostal muscles up front. Kind of makes sense. That makes sense? Now, intercostals branch from aorta, while the thoracic arteries branch from either subclavian or axillary. Oh, digital arteries. Yeah, I'm going to mention them. They run through the hand, and as far as I remember, the majority of blood vessels in the hand are actually here, not in the palm, which also makes perfect sense. As you do things with your palm, you don't want anything to get damaged. Okay. Abdominal. So we're going to mention some veins. Here you can see vena cava. Okay. That's the inferior vena cava. It runs to the heart from the bottom. So that's the opening. That's the point where inferior vena cava gets into the heart. And then you have aorta. That's abdominal aorta. Several branches. One pretty big is the common hepatic artery. Is the blood to the liver. Another pretty big branch is the splenic artery. Okay. Then you have rather small celiac trunk. It's short. Okay, so celiac trunk is actually where the hepatic artery and the splenic artery are branches off. Splenic artery branches further, and becomes left gastroepiploic. Gastro means stomach, left means on the left side. Makes perfect sense. Its continuation is the right gastroepiploic artery, which supplies the blood to the stomach from the right side. And there's an artery that leaves celiac trunk superiorly, gastric artery, left gastric artery, that supplies the superior portion of the stomach. And it's basically, it's a circle, left and right arteries. Okay, when it's on the left side of that circle, that's left gastric, right side is the right gastric. Gastroduodenal artery, here, supplies the pancreas, stomach, and the duodenum. Okay. And here you can see it's kind of not the main point of this. So this is the circulation that supplies the needs of the stomach and the pancreas. Superior mesenteric artery will supply organs that are lower. We're talking about small intestine. Okay? So this shows you the distribution of trunks and arteries in the abdominal aorta. So the most superficial is the celiac trunk. Okay? Common hepatic, splenic, and the gastric artery. They branch off the celiac trunk. Common hepatic here, splenic, which will become gastroepiploic eventually, and gastric. You have two phrenic arteries, which are incredibly important. Why? What do they supply? Phrenic. They bring blood to the diaphragm. It's a pretty big muscle, and you need it to work all the time. So it requires blood flow. A couple of lumbar arteries here. Pretty much supply blood to the lumbar region of the body. Renal, of course, the easiest arteries, and suprarenal. Renals bring blood. I'm sorry. Look how big renal arteries are. Can you see that? They're pretty large. Percentage of blood that your kidneys receive, they receive a quarter of your blood. So so your cardiac output on average is 5 liters per minute. So every minute your heart pumps about 5 liters of the blood. Quarter of it goes through the kidneys. Not because they're so greedy, but because they have to filter it. Does that make sense? And then you have superior mesenteric and you have inferior mesenteric artery. And these two are gonadal. They go to the testis or ovaries, depending on the gender. And abdominal aorta branches into two common iliac arteries. So if we want to picture it, it's not a bad idea to do that. So abdominal aorta. On top we have celiac trunk, which branches into the common hepatic, splenic, and gastric. And then we have superior mesenteric, inferior mesenteric. I can't do front, so I get to the side. Don't take it as they like go on the right side. Kind of think about it that it's slightly turned, okay? And they branch into two iliac arteries. In the meantime, at the level of superior mesenteric artery, you have renals, and slightly above you have suprarenals. And here you have two phrenics. Okay? Does that make sense? So that's kind of, the breakdown, the order that will help you to orient yourself when you look at it. Celiac, superior mesenteric, inferior mesenteric arteries. Yeah, that looks like a spider. So same celiac trunk to kind of orient yourself on the anatomy exam. And here you have superior mesenteric that starts to branch a lot. And when you look at it, like this one, middle colic, supplies colon, right? Right colic here, right side of the colon. Ileocolic will go closer to the ileocecal valve. It will still supply colon, but it will get closer to the ileocecal valve. And here you have left colic. Sigmoidal arteries will supply, obviously, sigmoid colon. And finally, you see the branching superior rectal artery that will supply blood to the rectum. Okay? Now, in the legs, so you've got common iliac, which branches into the internal iliac artery, and fairly short external iliac. External iliac branches into the deep artery of the thigh and the femoral. Now, if you will think about the analogy with the upper limbs, in upper limbs, subclavian artery becomes axillary, and then axillary branches into the deep artery of the arm and brachial. Here, you have deep artery of the thigh and femoral. One of the branches of internal iliac is obturator artery, which is actually the obturator nerve, the obturator artery are fairly easy to remember because they go through the obturator foramen. So that's obturator artery. Now, femoral artery will branch farther. It will branch into the popliteal. You can see here popliteal artery running in the back of the tibia. Okay, that's where popliteal artery branches off from the femoral. Okay, and then popliteal artery will branch farther into the anterior and posterior tibial. You can see posterior tibial on this picture. Okay, one of the branches from popliteal artery will be fibular. Okay, so we'll get to this. And then you have plantar arteries, lateral and medial. So if we would like to picture how it goes down, so you have common iliac, then you have external iliac and internal iliac. From internal iliac, you have obturator. External iliac branches into the deep artery of the thigh and femoral artery, which eventually will branch into the popliteal, which will give rise to the anterior tibial, posterior tibular, and fibular arteries. Okay? And then the posterior tibial artery, which is going to be here, will branch into the lateral and medial plantar. What I do here in this picture, that does separate lines that I make, I'm kind of looking from up front. So you can't really say, Sally, this is anterior tibial artery. This is posterior tibial artery. You can't, it's a 2D picture, you can't really say which one is up close, which one is back. Right? Now, veins. You may notice that, yeah, there's a lot, but basically, practically all veins are in this picture. All veins that you need to know. They're really, really small, so, we'll get a breakdown, okay? And I will be honest with you. If I'm talking about, say, ulnar vein or basilic vein, I'd rather show you a picture of an arm than the picture of the person, the whole person. I want it to be up, bigger, okay? So, you may notice that veins largely repeat the pattern that we find for arteries, correct? Can you see that? However, you can see veins, as we mentioned, they're more superficial. One of the reasons, of course, is protection. There's also a reason veins can't pump. So, not really, okay. They very minor pumping effect. So they need something else to move the blood through them, okay? And that's going to be your muscles. When your muscles squeeze, they squeeze veins and they push the blood. Does that make sense? So, we've got, now the problem with explanation of venular anatomy is that we say, oh, you have subclavian vein branching off. Think about what veins do. Where do they bring blood? Where do they bring blood? To the heart. So essentially, the brachiocephalic veins, they do not branch off the vena cava. They merge and form vena cava. Does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, I don't know. Here you have the basilic vein and the cephalic vein, brachial vein, basilic and brachial. They merge and form axillary. But we're not starting from the palms and making our way to the center. We're actually going to start at the big veins. We're going to start with vena cava. And I'm going to use words branch. Okay? Just remember that it's not really branching. So, two parts of vena cava. Is that okay if I'm going to use red? Check it out. If it doesn't work, let me know. I also have green in my possession. So, superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. Okay? Superior vena cava branches are brachiocephalic veins. Okay? So, left brachiocephalic vein branches into the subclavian and jugular. Same goes for right brachiocephalic, which branches into the jugular and subclavian. Subclavian branches off into the axillary, and who said cephalic refers to the head? Cephalic vein. So that's really bizarre. Over the time that, we had this anatomy exam, I basically tell you, remember, cephalic vein is not in the head. It's in the upper arm. Okay, just remember that. That's where cephalic vein is, right here. Because it's a trap. It's not me who created this trap, just remember. Okay, cephalic vein is in the arm. I know it doesn't make sense. Anyway. Now, axillary vein branches into the basilic, the medial, and brachial vein, which is a little bit deeper and it's in the middle. Okay? When you go from medial to lateral, you can say BBC, basilic, brachial, cephalic. Then there's a nice little short median cubital vein, which is often used for the drawing blood. Yeah. I'm very proud carrier of an enormously sized median to cubital vein. When I give blood, they tell me, they put a tourniquet and say, no, you don't have to. You're fine. Now, the basilic vein eventually extends all the way down to the palm. Same goes for cephalic, while the brachial one, I will show you the branching. It's really hard to appreciate in this picture. But there's a branching point right here. It branches into the radial and ulnar vein. Radial will be lateral, ulnar will be medial. Okay? Same goes on the right side. So I'm not going to go over the right hand. Now here you have hepatic veins. You have large splenic vein, and large splenic vein will collect the blood not only from spleen but also from the stomach. Then you have renal veins, and guess what? And hepatic portal vein. I'm not talking about coronary circulation yet. And vena cava branches into the iliac veins. It all goes the same. Okay, iliac veins will have the internal and external components. External iliac vein will become a femoral vein, and branching of external iliac will produce not only femoral but medial great saphenous. Okay, femoral will branch and produce popliteal vein. Popliteal vein will branch and produce posterior and anterior tubular. And now, what would you say? Oh, it's probably fibular. Turns out it's the small saphenous vein. Okay, you can see that, like, you go iliac, external, internal iliac, femoral, popliteal, anterior, posterior, tibial. It is all the same as with arteries. Okay, so it's much less to memorize. And yeah, I'm going to do a little digression. Did I tell you about my favorite study of the anatomy competency among second-year residents? You know what residency is? Medical residency. So second-year residents in several states in the U.S. were tested in their competency or competency. What's the right emphasis? I don't know. In anatomy. So they were given second year medical school exam that they passed back in the second year. Any guesses about results? Huh? They failed. Everybody except one profession. Which profession didn't fail? Oh, no. People who take people apart. Other live people apart. Surgeons, yes. Surgeons did perfect. Everybody else failed miserably. Like, orthopedic surgeons knew the anatomy of the body part they deal with, but that's about it. And I personally have no problem with that, surprisingly, because I don't care if my infectious disease doc knows the bones of the arm. By the way, the one that treated my son, he didn't. He called this second carpal, which is first metacarpal, so I had to correct him. And student had to correct. It wasn't resident, it was student had to correct him. And I don't care. He's a great infectious disease doctor. For these things, as wiki. There's no point to remember the sheer amount of information. And you may ask, well, why don't we use wiki? My purpose here is that you can identify major blood vessels. Okay? So when you look at the picture, you're not trying to find carotid in the leg, basically, and femoral in the head. Things like that. Very basic stuff. So I'm trying to ask basic stuff. okay? Because if we're talking about really tiny, small things, if you work with it, you're going to know it. If you don't, you're not going to remember it anyway. We have a joke when I was in college. What is education? Education is whatever's left in your head after you forgot everything that you've been taught in college. Okay? That's education. So, head. We're going to talk about brain second and other structures of the head first. So this is pretty large internal jugular vein. And when I worked with mice, I nicked it too. So we used vein to inject whatever we needed to inject, mostly different types of fluorescent dyes, and it was a pain in the ass to work with vein because artery is great. You can cannulate artery on the dead mouse. I did that. It's doable. You can completely cut the artery, given that you have a clamps, okay? And you can cannulate the cut artery, not nicked, but just like a sock. It pulls on the tube like a sock. Perfect. Thick, elastic vein? No. Cannulating the vein is the pain in the butt because the walls are really, really thin. Once you nick it, you also tie it. When you tie it, you don't have to put a clamp. You tie it, it collapses basically right away. And you nick it, and you have no clue what's going on there. You don't really see a hole in the vein. So you start sticking the cannula in the vein, and at first I always ripped it in pieces because the tube is really sharp and you just pierce it all the time. Well, the good thing about mice and other mammals that they have two jugular veins. So you just tie down and go to another side. Mice can survive it. They can survive two jugular veins, obstruction of two jugular veins. They can do it, yes. It's pretty interesting. I have a friend of mine, when she practiced, she cannulated two jugular veins, two carotid arteries, and as the triumph, she stuck the rectal temperature probe into the mouse's butt, and it looked pretty horrible. So the mouse was all like with tubes and wires out of it. But it's with small animals, it is nice because otherwise you cannot deliver the drugs, you cannot collect the blood, you cannot monitor temperature, only rectally, and they're all anesthetized. Now, jugular. That jugular vein branches into the bigger internal. Okay. Now another branch will give you superficial temporal, facial, and occipital vein, interestingly enough, it will branch out of the external jugular. Okay. So vertebral vein will branch from the subclavian one. And I think that's pretty much it what I wanted you to know in this instance. So, and it's basically self-explanatory. So you have internal jugular, which is deeper. Okay. You have external jugular, which is more superficial and smaller. You can remember external jugular and external jugular vein, external carotid artery are smaller. Internal jugular vein, internal carotid artery is bigger. Vertebral, which runs exactly along the spinal cord, superficial temporal region, facial, occipital. Now, the sinuses. What forms the sinuses? How are the sinuses that run around your brain? How are they formed? Two layers of dura mater, periosteal layer and meningeal layer. So dura mater has two layers separate, form basically triangular structure. That triangular structure is the sinus. Okay? Sinuses collect blood in the head. So superior sagittal runs pretty much in between the hemispheres. And you have inferior sagittal between the hemispheres, but in the lower part. Then you have straight sinus. Cavernous sinus, big, large, below the diencephalon. Transverse sinuses, they run to the sides. Sigmoid, S-shaped, and they all drain into the internal jugular vein. Okay, so basically that poor mouse that had both jugulars blocked probably had a pretty lousy drainage of the blood from the head. Okay. Now, veins of the arm and of the thorax. So as we mentioned, you have brachiocephalic trunk, brachiocephalic vein, which becomes subclavian, which branch into the cephalic. Again, remember, cephalic vein is in the arm. Don't tell me, oh, you told me that, now I'm looking for femoral in the head. No. Cephalic vein is in the arm, and that's about it. And axillary branches into the basilic and brachial. Sorry. So cephalic and basilic are connected by the median cubital, and you have radial and ulnar, which are branches of the brachial vein. Okay. Median and antebrachial branches of the basilic vein and runs superficially on the anterior aspect of your antebrachial region. The blood to the thorax is supplied by the intercostal veins, okay, posterior and anterior intercostals, and two azygous veins. So this is azygous, this is hemiazygous vein. And this brings us to the abdomen. In abdomen, probably the most tricky part is hepatic veins, really. So renal and suprarenal veins are obvious, aren't they? Big renal veins and suprarenals, right? And then you have hepatic veins. You see how many veins collect the blood from liver? Those hepatic veins bring the blood into the inferior vena cava, into the heart, and distribute that blood all over the body. Remember, blood that is drained from the liver not only contains obvious wastes of hepatocytes, it also contains, for instance, lipids that were processed and properly packaged during the digestive process. Or it may contain glucose that liver will produce in post-absorptive state. Then you have gonadal veins and iliac veins. Okay. Now, here we come to the reminder about the enterohepatic circulation. So you see this large vein. This is the hepatic portal vein. So hepatic portal vein essentially connects intestine and the liver. Basically, blood goes from hepatic portal, from the intestine, where you have primary absorption of nutrients. Blood goes through the hepatic portal vein to the liver, gets processed, and then is collected into the vena cava by the hepatic veins. You can see splenic vein, the same deal. Splenic vein will run towards the spleen, but it will branch off to supply blood to the stomach. It will essentially produce the branch of gastroepiploic vein, will supply the word stomach. And then you have mesenteric veins, the inferior one and the superior one. So this may look a little bit counterintuitive. If you think about it, what is the order of the colonic parts? So you go cecum, then you have ascending, transverse, descending sigmoid. So superior mesenteric vein will supply the blood to the ascending colon, the parts of the small intestine and the cecum, sort of a proximal part of the intestine. While the inferior mesenteric vein will bring blood to the descending and sigmoid colon. Does that make sense? Well, again, I say bring blood. Take the blood away, for God's sakes. Take the blood away. Okay? I always, I keep thinking in delivering blood. And finally, we have a leg. So just to kind of show you, this is looking up front. This is looking from the back. Essentially, this is my own enlargement of this. I had a chance to just make it big. So you have, common ileum. Now, if you wonder, what is that idiot that made the font so small? It wasn't me. Publisher slides. One advantage of using publisher pictures is that they're really good quality, because they pay a lot to the graphic designers that make those pictures. If you look at the syllabus and if you look at the book, that's sort of, it's not recommended, but kind of, you can go online and read it, free book. Pictures there are okay. Because when you don't pay graphic designers, they're not going to produce as high quality thing. Anyway, common ileum breaks into the internal and external. External gets into the femoral and branches off as great saphenous vein. Okay. Femoral will go to the back of the leg as the popliteal vein, and popliteal vein will branch back into the anterior tibial, right here. So it goes into the little hole in the interosseous membrane between the tibia and fibula. And other branches will include small saphenous, fibular, and posterior tibial veins. So in this, you will see the popliteal vein, which gives rise to the lateral small saphenous and posterior tibial. Fibular vein can be seen right there. So you can appreciate that both small saphenous and fibular, they eventually run laterally on the leg, but fibular is more lateral. Okay? Now, we're going to take a break. What I want to highlight, only things that are in the study guide. It's all going to be multiple choice. When you study, my great suggestion, not just, label, but don't sort of label blindly. Think about it. Does that make sense? So you label subclavian, ask yourself, why is it subclavian? Because it's under the clavicle. You label brachial, why is it brachial? Because it's upper arm. You label cephalic, you say because it was some moron that named the lateral vein of the upper arm cephalic. Does that make sense? Okay?